I was home alone for Christmas, so I decided to watch some movies and order some takeout. I got my favorite movie, The Silence of the Lambs, and ordered myself some pad thai. As I was watching the movie, I started to eat my dinner, and I just had this sudden craving for dessert. So I called up my favorite Chinese restaurant and asked if they delivered ice cream. The lady on the phone said, "We do have fortune cookies, though. Would you like some?" I thought to myself, how does she know? She must be psychic. And I said, "Yes, please." The total came out to $175. I paid and hung up. When the delivery guy knocked on the door, I opened it and he handed me a little bag with a smile. "Is that all you got?" I asked him, referring to the fact that I ordered only dessert. He shrugged his shoulders and drove off. I walked back into my living room and I sat down on the couch. When I looked into the bag, there were 4 fortune cookies in it. I was confused because I've always gotten 1 fortune cookie per order. This was strange. I reached out to grab the first one, but when I did, I noticed something peculiar. Blood was seeping out of the fortune cookie. It wasn't syrup or anything like that. It was dark red and fresh-looking, almost like someone had bit into the cookie with blood coming out of their mouth. I threw the cookie back into the bag and grabbed another one, but that one had blood dripping from the corner of the cookie. I reached in again and tried grabbing another one, but I stopped when I saw the third cookie, which had the same bloody dripping effect, except it also had something written on it. I took a deep breath and picked up the 4th and final cookie. I didn't want to see what was on it. I just wanted to throw it in the garbage, but when I did, the cookie crumbled in my hand, and that's when I noticed the writing on that one too. Both cookies had the same message scrunched onto them. I don't remember exactly what it said. I only remember parts of it. It went something like, "Do not open the bag until midnight. Do not eat alone." I was scared, but I was also curious. So instead of throwing away the rest of the cookies, I put them in my freezer. After the movie was over, I played some video games. The time ticked by really fast, and before I knew it, it was midnight. I took the cookies out of the freezer, and since I was still hungry, I figured why not. I ate the cookie. But when I did, the taste of metal hit my tongue. It was awful. After I swallowed, I felt sick to my stomach. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. When I looked into the toilet, the puke was bright red. It was blood-colored. I was terrified. I washed my hands and went to sleep. The next morning after I woke up, I felt even sicker than I did the day before. I tried to get out of bed, but when I did, I blacked out. I don't know how long I laid there for, but eventually I got up and staggered to the bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, and I could tell immediately that I was pale. My eyes were wide with terror. Then the next thing I knew, I was lying on the bathroom floor with blood trickling down my mouth. I had bitten my tongue. I must have done it while I was sleeping. I stood up and walked out of the bathroom. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. I thought, how can there be footsteps? I live alone. The footsteps were getting louder and closer, but they weren't coming from my room. They were coming from inside the walls. I started to run around my apartment looking for the source of the noise. There had to be an explanation, maybe a pipe burst or something. But there was no explanation. No pipes had burst. No animals had gotten into my house. And as the minutes passed by, the footsteps grew louder and more intense. Suddenly, the ceiling started to crack. A hole ripped open in the middle of it, and a dark, slimy vine shot out of it. More vines followed, inching closer and closer to me. I screamed and ran, but there was nowhere for me to go. The vines were wrapping themselves around my legs, pulling me toward the hole in the ceiling. I tried to pull myself away, but they wouldn't budge. Before I knew it, I was being dragged up the wall. I struggled against the vines, but they were far stronger than I was. I kicked and clawed, but the harder I fought, the tighter they held on to me. I tried to scream for help, but all that came out of my mouth was a gurgle. Eventually, the vines pulled me all the way up the wall. I looked down at the apartment below me and yelled, "Help me!" But no one could hear me. The last thing I remember is being pulled through the hole in the ceiling and into the darkness above my apartment. Hi, I'm here with another Scary Stories. Welcome back. Let me set the scene for tonight's scary story. It's a cold winter night. The wind outside is howling like a wolf. You're sitting all alone in your home. Thunder cracks in the distance, making the windows rattle. You feel a cold breeze sweep across your neck, but when you turn around, no one's there. The temperature drops, and you hear chains dragging metal moans. This is the perfect time for a scary story. So make sure you leave a like rating on this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tap that bell notification so you never miss an upload. And then you can settle in, because I'm about to begin tonight's frightening tale. A man moved into a new house. It was a big old mansion with lots of rooms, hallways, and staircases. The first night he was there, he heard chains dragging metal moans. He ignored it, thinking it was probably just some old house settling or something. The next night, he heard it again, and it seemed to be coming from the attic. He decided to check it out. As he made his way up the creaky wooden stairs, the sound of chains continued. When he got to the top of the stairs and turned the corner, he noticed a single heavy metal chain hanging down from the ceiling. At the end of the chain was an old rusted bucket. The man reached out and touched the bucket, and suddenly the chains started moving on their own. They whipped back and forth, getting faster and faster. He turned around and ran. The chains came crashing down, barely missing his head. Now terrified, he tried to run back down the stairs, but each step he took sounded like an earthquake. He tripped, fell, and broke his leg. Blood poured out of the wound, mixing with the dust on the floor. The man cried out in pain and screamed for help, but no one could hear him. Not a single soul lived within miles of the house. And as the night wore on, the sound of chains continued to echo throughout the halls. This is scary. These are scary stories. And today we're looking at creepy pasta stories about hiking trails. If you enjoy these stories, please show your support. Let's start off with a story called The Silent Forest Path. Locals told me not to hike the old trail during storms, but I wanted the adventure. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, only rain tapping leaves. I walked on, hoping to find another hiker. It had been years since I'd seen anyone else on this overgrown path. A deer. The trail led to a clearing where a group of Boy Scouts had set up camp for the night. I didn't see any tents, so they must have packed up early this morning. As I walked past their empty campsite, something glinted in the wet sand. I bent down and found 6 pairs of shoes neatly lined up in a row. 3 pairs were sneakers, 3 were sandals. All were worn, but otherwise identical. What are the odds, I thought, pulling my own shoes from my backpack to put on dry socks. I laced them back up and continued on my way. But after only a few steps, I heard something crunching behind me. I turned around to see what was coming up the path toward me. It was the first sound I'd heard other than the rain for the entire hike. I couldn't make out any words. All I could hear was that crunching. Then I realized I wasn't hearing it. I was feeling it. Tiny vibrations seemed to pass through my legs and up my spine. At first it was just a dull tremor, but then it grew stronger, matching the rhythm of the crunching sound. My arms began to tingle too, and as the sensation spread, I lost control of my legs and collapsed onto the soft earth. The last thing I remember was that crunching sound, growing louder until it was deafening. When I came to, my head was resting on something soft. I raised my head and recoiled in disgust. My face crumpled. In front of me was a rotting log covered in worms. Where am I? I asked myself. Why did I do this to myself? I tried to stand up, but collapsed again when a stabbing pain shot through my leg. I looked down and saw a stick sticking out of my shin, splitting it wide open. Panic seized me and I started screaming. I kicked and clawed, trying to pull the stick out, but it wouldn't budge. It was jammed deep in there. Exhausted and terrified, I slumped against the log. Then I noticed something strange. Around the stick, embedded in my skin, were tiny imprints of bare feet, as if little toes had been digging their marks into my leg before disappearing. Then I remembered the shoes. I scrambled over to the path and ran. I don't remember how long I ran or why I didn't look back, but eventually the crunching stopped. When I finally slowed down, I was kneeling in a small clearing near the base of a cliff. Shaking and sobbing, I made my way home, stumbling through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. After what felt like hours, I saw the faint lights of my car in the distance. I stumbled toward it, my leg throbbing the whole way. Once I reached my car, I collapsed onto the hood, shivering uncontrollably. My body was soaked through even though it was clear. I don't know how long I stayed on the hood. Maybe a minute, maybe an hour. Eventually, the pain in my leg subsided and I forced myself to look. The wound was horrifying. My shin was split wide open, revealing the white spongy tissue underneath. The cut was shaped like a footprint, and around that print were dozens of smaller divots, like little pebbles had been pressed into my leg. I don't want to be too graphic, but I remember thinking, whoever or whatever did this to me has really messed up my plans for dinner tonight. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. I could tell the operator I'd cut my leg on some hidden glass, that I'd been attacked by a wild animal. Anything except the truth. Because the truth was far more terrifying, and I knew whoever or whatever had hurt me was still out there waiting. The next story is called Lost on the Trail. This happened many years ago, but it still keeps me up at night. We had been backpacking for 2 days on the Appalachian Trail in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. On the second day, we came across a couple of hikers who were heading in the same direction as us. They warned us that the trail was extremely slick because of the recent rains and that there was no safe way to cross the creek we would have to ford. If we chose to go on, we would have to wait for several days for it to become less slippery. They also said that they had seen a black bear the night before and recommended that we set up camp somewhere near the creek so we would be away from the bear. We decided to listen to their advice. We pitched our tent in a spot we hoped was far enough away from the creek that we wouldn't have to cross it that night. However, because the ground was so wet, our tent kept filling with water and we had to pack up and move. So we decided to hike to a spot farther up the trail and wait out the storm there. We hiked about 2 miles up the trail when we realized that the storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. While we were looking for a place to pitch our tent, we came across a trail marker indicating that we were 3 miles from the car. We thought, great, we can just walk back to our car once the weather clears up. We pitched our tent and waited for the storm to pass. About 30 minutes later, we heard what sounded like screams in the forest. We thought it was just the wind. 2 hours later, we heard the screams again, and they sounded close. I unzipped the tent and looked out. We were the only ones on the trail. We went back into the tent and zipped it shut. Several minutes later, we heard the screams again, and they were right outside the tent. We screamed and made tons of noise, but the commotion outside the tent continued. Finally, the noise stopped. Maybe it was a bear looking for food, we thought. In the morning after, of course, the bear hadn't come back to finish us off in our sleep. We unzipped the tent to the creepiest scene. All around the tent were thousands of little pebbles that were not there the evening before. Someone or something had spent the night throwing pebbles at our tent. We quickly gathered our things and started hiking. About 5 minutes into our hike, we came across the spot where we had pitched our tent the night before. And sure enough, there was the black bear that had been warned us about. It was sitting on its haunches right where we had camped the night before. We stopped, stared at each other for a moment, and then the bear took off running down the trail. We turned and ran back to our car, practically sprinting the whole way. I never want to hike in the Smoky Mountains again. The next story is called A Hike Gone Wrong. I used to work at a summer camp in Maine. We had campers from all over the world. One camper in particular, whose name I'll change to Adam, insisted that there were ghosts in the woods. He was from England. He'd say things like, "You guys won't believe me, but there's bound to be ghosts in those woods." Anyway, he was talking about the woods behind our cabins where there were miles and miles of hiking trails. One night, Adam convinced a couple of us counselors to sneak out and hike to the Dead Man's Hill, the highest point in the area. From there, he said we'd be able to see forever. Plus, it was a full moon and maybe we'd see Bigfoot. So off we went into the forest. The forest was filled with the sounds of crickets and owls. There were trees everywhere, and the ground was covered with pine needles. It was beautiful. We hiked for what felt like hours, and it was silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. Suddenly, welcome to my channel. In today's video, we will be reading from the No Sleep subreddit. So let's jump into it. Story 3. The Old Neighbor's Window. When I was a kid, my bedroom faced the old neighbor's house. The upstairs window was always dark, but at night I'd sometimes see a pale face watching me. My parents said the house was empty. We didn't get many visitors, and almost no one ever came to our door. Even during the day, I could go weeks without seeing anyone outside. My bedroom window was my view of the world. I would spend hours lying on my bed watching the clouds drift by or spying on my neighbors. One day, my dad was over at the neighbor's house and he came back looking angry. He told my mom that he was going to have a chat with the neighbor. I heard them talking about selling the house and moving away. At first, I was disappointed. I hated change, and I was worried that if they moved, I wouldn't get to see my friends anymore. But then I realized that I might finally get a new view from my window. The next few days, I saw the neighbor's moving truck. They were coming and going, packing up stuff, then bringing it out to the truck. On the last day, I saw my neighbor standing at the upstairs window waving to someone inside. I waved back. He smiled, and then he disappeared. That night, my parents and I ate dinner while watching TV. No one said a word. Suddenly, a loud crash came from outside. We all looked at each other. Then we started yelling at each other. Who was out there? What was it? It sounded like it was right outside my window. My parents started arguing about who was going to go check it out. Finally, my dad got up and went to get his baseball bat from the closet. My mom said that he shouldn't go outside because whatever was out there could be dangerous. Then she left the room crying. When my dad opened the front door, the wind snatched it out of his hands and slammed it against the wall. The power went out. Only the streetlights were still on. My dad called for help, but no one could come over until the storm passed. I was scared, so I went to my parents' room and hid under the covers with them. I could feel their bodies shaking with fear. Every time there was a flash of lightning, I would scream, and every time thunder clapped, I could hear my parents screaming too. Then, in the middle of the night, the wind suddenly stopped. All was silent except for the sound of the rain hitting the roof. My parents were fast asleep. I got out from under the covers and went to my window. I was so bored of looking at the dark street that I decided to look next door. The curtains were blowing in the wind. I could see the faint outline of a rocking chair. Then I saw a face. It was pressed against the glass and smiling. I don't know why, but that was the scariest thing I had ever seen. In the morning, after the sun came back and the power came back on, I told my parents what I had seen. They both looked annoyed. I knew that my dad was probably annoyed because I woke him up, but I didn't care. I wanted to tell someone. I think my mom was annoyed because she knew that the house was supposed to be empty. She told my dad that whoever was in the house wasn't important. Maybe it was just some crazy homeless person. Let's just leave it alone. My dad didn't say anything, but later on he went next door to check it out. I stayed in my room drawing pictures of spooky houses. After about an hour, I heard my dad come back in. I could hear his voice raised in anger. Then I heard my mom's voice raised too. They were yelling at each other. I drew a picture of a ghost and wrote, "Help." Then I went to my window to wait for my dad to come back. He was soaked from head to toe. His clothes were ripped. He tried to unlock the front door, but it was locked. He pounded on it. Then he kicked it. When he finally got inside, he took off his shoes and threw them across the room. He looked at me and screamed, "Get your ass down here right now." I was scared, so I ran. At the bottom of the stairs, he picked me up and carried me back to my room. He set me down and asked me if I had seen anyone strange outside. I shook my head. He asked me if anyone had been in my room while he was gone. Again, I shook my head. He looked at me for a second, then he ran out of the house again. When he came back, he looked defeated. He told me that the house was locked, covered in dust, and totally empty. but the upstairs window was wide open. Then he took me outside and showed me 2 sets of fresh, wet footprints. That's the end of the story. If you liked it, please hit the like button, and if you want to hear more stories like this, stay tuned. Also, let me know in the comments, should I read the bonus story? And if so, which one? Until next time, don't forget, I love you. Welcome to my channel. And now, with your eyes closed, try to imagine the most frightening thing that could happen to you while fishing. Was it alligators? Sharks? Crabs that pinch really hard? Well then, as a grand finale, what if you were to hear muffled voices coming up from the depths of the lake, begging you to pull them up to the surface? You'd probably drop your fishing rod and run away screaming as fast as you could. But not our fisherman. Nope. He decides to investigate, and what he finds will make your blood run cold. In today's story, we'll find out exactly what lurks in the depths of this lake. Our fisherman loved nothing more than fishing alone. It was his only hobby. In fact, many people considered him a weirdo because he would spend all day by the lake and sometimes even sleep in his little shack right on the shore. But he didn't mind. The man loved fishing too much to care about other people's opinions. He liked the tranquility of the lake, the chirping of birds, and the warm sun on his skin. But most of all, he loved fishing during storms. The sight of dark clouds gathering overhead, the smell of ozone, and, of course, the sound of rain hitting the surface of the water was incredibly relaxing for him. That's why one evening when a storm was raging outside, he decided to go fishing again. The man put on his raincoat, grabbed his fishing rod, and headed to the lake. He cast his line into the water and sat down on the shore to wait for the fish to bite. But as soon as he settled down, he heard voices. At first, they were indistinguishable and sounded like the wind. But gradually, he began to make out the words. "Pull us up, please, pull us up," they whispered. The man thought he was going crazy. He strained to listen. The voices grew louder. "Pull us up!" The fisherman looked around. There was no one there. The voices seemed to be coming from the lake itself. His fishing rod suddenly went taut, heavy, as if something had grabbed onto it and was trying to drag it down into the water. The fisherman felt a chill run down his spine. With trembling hands, he began to reel in his bait. Something was definitely there, but what? The man's face turned pale as he saw what was hooked on his fishing rod. It was an old waterlogged jacket. Without thinking twice, he pulled it out of the water and took off his own jacket to see if there was anyone in there. It was empty. But when he turned it inside out, he found a wallet. The man took out the contents and saw his own ID photo staring back at him. At that moment, the sky cracked, and lightning flashed right above him. The fisherman screamed and fell to his knees. As he looked up at the surface of the lake, he saw dozens of pale faces staring up at him, right at him. They were just beneath the water, peering out at him with their mouths open wide. The man screamed again, dropped the jacket, and ran as fast as he could away from the lake. He didn't dare look back. Even now, safe in his house, the fisherman still hears the whispers, "Pull us up, please, pull us up." And every time he sees a jacket just like that one, he thinks he's going crazy. After all, who else would understand what he saw that night, what he felt, and what he heard? Friends, what would you do if you were in this fisherman's place? Be sure to share your thoughts. And that's all for today. See you later. Bye. This happened to me when I was in high school. It was a Friday night and my friends dared me to sneak into the abandoned school across town with them. Apparently the place was haunted, and the local legend said that if you stayed in the school after midnight, you would never be seen again. Of course, we didn't believe any of that. What did I have to lose? My parents had already kicked me out because I was grounded and I wasn't exactly on good terms with them anyway. So off I went into the dark, stormy night. The school loomed before me, all dark and foreboding. I followed my friends up the fire escape and into the building. Rain dripped through the broken ceiling and the wind howled like a wounded animal. As we crept through the shadowy halls, I couldn't shake this feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind made me jump. We found some old yearbooks lying around, and we flipped through them, laughing at the outdated fashion sense of the students and making fun of the awkward senior pictures. But as the minutes ticked by, the storm outside grew louder. Thunder rattled the windows and lightning illuminated the room in an eerie, bright white light. Then we heard it, the sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a voice, a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it was my imagination, the product of a tired mind and a scary situation. But then we heard it again, and whatever it was getting closer. We turned and ran, crashing through the doors at the end of the hall and into what looked like the Principal Ez's office. The room was empty except for a large oak desk, a leather chair behind it, and a full-length mirror on the wall. We huddled together, trying to catch our breath and ignoring the pounding of our hearts. Then one of my friends noticed something written on the chalkboard. "Detention, 4 students." He erased it. "Only 3 of us are here," I said, trying to sound brave. "Maybe whoever wrote that just forgot that someone left," another friend said, but he sounded scared. Suddenly, the desk behind us screeched as it moved back on its own. We whirled around and stared at it in disbelief. Then our eyes widened in horror as a 4th seat at the desk filled itself. We turned back to the chalkboard. Whoever was playing this cruel joke on us had written, "Class begins now." And then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt my friends tense beside me. They were as scared as I was. Then I heard a crash and a blood-curdling scream. One of my friends was on the ground, his glasses askew and his eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" he stammered, scrambling to his feet. Just then, the lights flickered back on, and we saw that the chalkboard had new words written on it. This time it read, "No exits. You may leave, but you may never return." We were trapped, and if that wasn't bad enough, our phones went dead. No signal. I tried to call out the window, but my voice caught in my throat. All 4 of us just stared at each other, paralyzed with fear. Then we heard it again, that same raspy voice that had sent us running earlier. It was right behind us. We screamed and turned to face whatever was in that room with us. But when the creature stepped into the light, we all gasped. It was a woman, or what was once a woman. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow sockets, and her mouth was a gaping, toothless abyss. She shuffled closer, her gaze fixed on us with an otherworldly intensity. In a voice that was like nails on a chalkboard, she rasped, "Who wants to learn about the art of screaming?" Before any of us could respond, she lunged. And the last thing I remember is the smell of decay and the feel of sharp teeth tearing into my flesh. Now, if you want to hear more scary stories, stay tuned. I promise you won't regret it. If you don't, then bye. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye. Hello, I'm here with 6 more scary stories. Story 5, The Attic Door. It all started when I moved into my new apartment. The real estate agent showed me everything, but I never went up to the attic. The first time I went up there, I felt an intense feeling of dread. There were spiders everywhere, dead and alive. There was also this weird doll staring at me. I immediately decided to cover it with a blanket. I never went back up there until one day I heard scratching sounds coming from above me. I told myself it was just rats. But then the scratching stopped, and when I went to check, the doll was gone. I was scared and confused, but I decided to investigate further. There was a hole in the ceiling directly above the doll's place, and I could see that there were no rats in the attic. But whatever had taken the doll must have been big because there were big scratches all over the walls around the hole. I got so freaked out that I ran downstairs, locked the front door, and hid under my desk. But eventually I got bored of hiding and went back upstairs to fix the hole. I took a deep breath, grabbed a broom, and went up to the attic. As soon as I got up there, I saw that the doll was back in its original position. But something was different. It wasn't facing forward anymore. It was now staring straight at the hole in the ceiling. Story 4, The Dresser. I grew up in a very old Victorian house, and every room had extremely heavy furniture bolted to the floor. One of the rooms was my parents' bedroom, and in the corner of the room was this massive, like 8-foot-long dresser made of solid wood. One night, I was woken up by what sounded like screams in the middle of the night. Of course, being 10 years old, I just assumed it was a nightmare. However, every night for the next week, I would be woken up at precisely 3:33 a.m. by these screams. Eventually, my parents caved and let me sleep in their room. One night while I was sleeping, I was awoken by a loud bang and then silence. I got up and walked towards the sound, which was coming from my parents' dresser. I slowly opened the top drawer, and inside was a stack of old letters. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to take them out and read them. The letters were written in a language I didn't recognize, and they were filled with pleas for help and cries of anguish. After I read them, the letters spontaneously combusted into flames and turned to ash. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the bed. It was hunched over and dragging itself closer and closer. I screamed at the top of my lungs, and my parents came rushing in. The shadowy figure vanished, but my parents couldn't see anything. This happened several times over the next few weeks, and each time I managed to read one of the letters before they burned up. Eventually, my parents decided to move out of that house and burn the letters in a fire pit outside. Since moving, I haven't seen or heard from that shadowy figure again. Story 3, Cemetery Visit. I used to go visit my grandmother's grave quite often. She passed away when I was young, so I have a lot of childhood memories there. I stopped going after I turned 18. About a year after that, I got a phone call from my dad saying that her headstone was knocked over and she was dug up. Apparently, someone stole her body. I thought it was horrible, but my dad said it's common where we live. The cemetery is surrounded by woods, so I never felt safe visiting alone. So I always brought my older brother. Well, a few days after this happened, I had a dream about my grandmother. She told me she wasn't dead, and she wanted to see me. I woke up crying, thinking I should go visit. I called my brother, but he was in the army at the time, so I asked my dad if he would accompany me to the cemetery. He agreed. We got there, and it was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, and the birds were tweeting. As we approached the grave, we saw that it had been freshly dug up again, and there was no headstone. But we knew that she wasn't inside. My dad looked at me and said, "Let's get out of here." But as we were walking away, we heard voices. They were coming from the fresh grave. Then we heard footsteps. My dad and I started running. We didn't stop until we got home. To this day, I still don't know if my grandmother's spirit was trapped in that cemetery or if she really did rise from the dead. Story 2, The Ghost Train. There's a small town near me that has a train track running straight through it. It's completely abandoned now, but it used to be used to transport coal. A long time ago, there was a terrible accident where a passenger train collided with an empty coal train. The coal train derailed, crashed into a bridge, and many people died. Now, sometimes at night, I hear the sound of a train whistle in the distance. I assumed it was a dream, but then I started hearing the sound more and more often. One day, I was watching TV when I suddenly heard the sound right outside my window. Startled, I ran to the window and looked out. All I saw was a thick fog covering the train tracks. I waited, but the sound never came again. One night, though, I was awoken in my bed by the sound of a train. I went to the window and saw that it was a clear night. There was not a single cloud in the sky. Yet somehow I could see the faint outlines of a train chugging along the tracks. I continued watching until it disappeared into the distance. Since then, I've heard the ghost train many times, but I've never seen it again. Story 1, The Dollhouse. My sister and I were given a dollhouse when we were little girls. We loved playing with it. We would set up little scenes and tell stories about the tiny people who lived inside. One day, my mother cleaned out the attic and brought some antique furniture down to put in the dollhouse. After she left, I climbed into the dollhouse and started rearranging the furniture. That's when I noticed that one of the chairs was rocking by itself. I was scared. So I ran out of the room and told my mom what I had seen. She laughed and said it was just the wind. But I knew it was something else. One day, while playing, my sister and I made the family in the dollhouse go to bed. When we returned the next day, the family was sitting upright in their chairs as if they were having a seance. We were terrified, so we quickly took them out and put them back in bed. That night, we heard footsteps coming from our living room. We were too scared to go downstairs, so we peeked over the railing. What we saw made us scream. In the dim light of the hallway, we saw the tiny family from the dollhouse marching around the room. They seemed to be looking for something. Then they disappeared. We were shaking with fear, but we didn't want to admit that the dollhouse was haunted. We continued playing with it, but after that incident, we never put the family back in the dollhouse. We only put them in on special occasions like Christmas or our birthdays. Once we got a bit older, we stopped playing with the dollhouse altogether. We put it in the attic where it's stayed ever since. Those are 6 more scary stories from my life. And if you want to hear more, stay tuned. The rain was coming down in buckets. I don't think this payphone has worked in decades, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as I walked past it. It was one of those red emergency boxes with glass windows and a door that swung open with a loud creak. It had been years since anyone had used it, and the receiver was long gone, leaving only a frayed and tangled mess of wires where it once hung. I quickened my pace, pulling my collar tighter around me as I hurried to get home. As I passed by the phone booth, the sound of thunder rolled overhead, and just as I reached the safety of my apartment building, the phone in the booth started to ring. I stopped dead in my tracks, every instinct in my body screaming at me to keep moving. But something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was morbid curiosity or the promise of a story, but I ended up picking up the receiver. There was a dial tone, and I could have sworn the sound was whispering my name. I don't know how long I stood there talking to the disconnected receiver, but eventually I heard a voice. It was raspy and scratchy, like fingernails on a chalkboard. At first, all I could make out were the words, "Don't go home." And then it said it again, louder this time. "Don't go home tonight. He's waiting." The voice was identical to mine, as if I was hearing my own thoughts spoken aloud. And the last thing I heard before I slammed the receiver back into its cradle was the echo of a terrifying warning. Shaking with fear, I broke into a run, practically flying through the glass doors and down the hallway towards my apartment. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting inside, locking the door, and hiding. I fumbled with my keys, but thankfully the rain had let up enough for me to see the numbers on the keypad. I punched in the code and finally pushed open the door. The entryway was dark and empty, but as I stepped further inside, I noticed something horrifying. There were muddy footprints on the floor. They started by the front door and led directly to my bedroom. My heart pounded against my ribs as I cautiously made my way through the apartment. Where did these footprints come from? And more importantly, who was that on the phone? My apartment was supposed to be empty. My boyfriend Ben was on a business trip and wouldn't be back for another week. I was the only one who had a key, and I hadn't let anyone in since Ben and I moved in together 6 months ago. Suddenly, a noise from the bedroom made me jump. I froze, listening intently. There was a soft, shuffling sound, followed by what seemed like a low growl. Whatever was in there was definitely still moving around. Adrenaline surged through me, and I found myself taking small steps towards the bedroom, my eyes wide with terror. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what was in there, but something kept me moving forward. I peered over the edge of the bed, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the room, under my dresser, was a pair of feet. They were covered in mud and looked like they had been caked on with a thick layer of dirt. As I watched, the feet started moving again, this time scrambling closer to the edge of the dresser. Whatever was under there was definitely trying to get out. And then I saw a hand. It was covered in the same thick layer of mud, and it reached out towards me, fingers splayed. I screamed and stumbled back, knocking over a chair in the process. As the creature continued to emerge from under my dresser, I could make out its shape. It was humanoid, hunched over and covered in so much dirt that it looked like a human-sized mole. It took another step towards me, and that's when I saw its face, or what was left of it. Where its nose should have been was a gaping hole filled with sharp, jagged teeth. I don't want to be too graphic, but it was clear this creature wasn't human. Its skin was a sickly gray color, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark pits that stared blankly ahead. In a panic, I turned and ran for the door, but the creature was faster than I was. It reached out and grabbed my ankle, yanking me off my feet. For a moment, we were both on the ground in a tangled mess of limbs. But the creature quickly got to its feet and dragged me towards the bedroom wall. Embedded in the wood paneling was a nail, one that stuck out a little too far and hadn't been hammered in properly. With one swift movement, the creature slammed my head into it. The last thing I remember is staring up at its grotesque face as it loomed over me, its hot, fetid breath washing over my skin. It whispered something in my ear, but all I could make out were the words, "You shouldn't have," and then everything went black. The storm was so bad the buses stopped running, so I thought I'd catch the midnight train. It was packed, but I found a seat, and then I saw him. A man in a long, dark coat sitting across from me. He stared straight ahead, not blinking, his eyes like chips of ice. I glanced at the window. We weren't passing any stations. All I could see was endless forest, lit by flashes of lightning. I asked the conductor, "Where are we?" He looked at me like I was a moron. "Where do you think we are?" "This is the forest line, lady." I frowned. "But the buses stopped running. I thought I could catch a train instead." The conductor shrugged. "Well, you can't get off at any of the stops along here. It doesn't stop anywhere." He pointed to a faded sign. "Next stop, Whispering Pines, 2 miles. I looked back at the sign as we passed it. It read, "Beware of train." Now the wind was really picking up. The trees were whipping past the window, and the rhythmic clackety-clack of the train on the tracks was getting louder. And then it hit me. This isn't just a train. This is the Midnight Express. The very same train that had been advertised on the billboards all along the highway. The one with the creepy forest creature on it. And then the man in the dark coat spoke. "You shouldn't have taken this train." I asked him why, but he just kept staring ahead. I turned back to the window just in time to see a pair of glowing yellow eyes in the darkness. They were close behind us. Then another pair and another until dozens of pairs of eyes were boring into us from the darkness. They surrounded the train, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all staring at me. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to get off the train, but the doors were locked. One of the eyes in the darkness was green. It glowed brighter than the rest. It seemed to be coming closer. I pressed my face against the glass, my breath fogging it up. Then a branch tapped on the window. I recoiled, but it just tapped again. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it moved away. Another branch tapped the window behind me. Then a face appeared, pale, gaunt, with wild eyes. He mouthed, "Get off the train," then vanished. I started pounding on the glass, screaming, "Stop the train! Please, please stop the train!" But the conductor just shook his head. "This train doesn't stop for anyone." More faces pressed against the windows, all of them begging, some of them snarling. I could feel their icy gazes boring into me. They were so close now, their hands tapping against the glass, their faces inches from mine. And I could hear their voices whispering, hissing, their words unintelligible. Then the train lurched to a halt. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. I screamed, "Help me!" But there was no reply, only the sound of heavy breathing. Then the doors at the end of the carriage slid open. I stumbled out onto a narrow platform. I turned to thank the conductor, but he was gone. I looked back at the train. Its lights were flickering again. I turned to run, but something grabbed my ankle and pulled me down. I screamed, thrashing about, trying to free myself from whatever had a hold of me. But it was no use. Whatever it was far stronger than I was. Then I felt something wet and cold lapping at my face. I looked up into the eyes of a wolf, its hot, fetid breath on my face. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The train lurched forward, the sound of the bell growing louder and louder until it drowned out the wolf's snarls. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground beside the train tracks. The sun was shining through the trees, and the only sound I could hear was the gentle lapping of water. I sat up and saw that I was in a clearing beside a lake. The Midnight Express was nowhere to be seen. And then I noticed the scratches on my arms, deep, angry red lines. I pressed my fingers against them and made out the shape of a handprint that was far too big to belong to anyone I knew. My weirdest college memory is definitely about my very first apartment. I had just moved away from home and I wanted somewhere cheap so I could save up money for, fun things like going out and having a social life. So I found this basement apartment that met all of my needs except for one tiny detail. It was in a bad part of town. But I was young and invincible and stupid, so I didn't care. The apartment was fine, a little creepy, but fine. Water would randomly drip through cracks in the ceiling. And at night, when the wind and rain would pick up, it sounded like someone was walking around directly above my head. I told myself it was just old pipes or something. I didn't really think about it much. I mean, I had bigger concerns like how I was going to make enough money to buy pizza and beer with. Then one night I woke up in the middle of a thunderclap, and I turned to my side to see the flashes of lightning illuminating the room, and then I noticed it. In the corner of the room, opposite my bed, where the wall met the ceiling, there was a door. Now, this wasn't an exterior door or anything. There were no windows nearby. It was just a plain wooden door in what looked like a wall of plaster, and I knew for a fact that I had never seen that door before. So, of course, in the middle of the storm, I got out of bed to investigate. I mean, what else was I gonna do? Go back to sleep? This was way more exciting. I reached out a hand to push open the door, but it didn't budge. I tried again, and it still didn't move. Then I remembered I had a crowbar in my closet from when I had briefly considered getting into the whole moving heavy things for a living thing. I pulled it out and shoved it into the crack beside the door and pried it open. And then I was very nearly blinded by the light from the other side. I squinted and stepped over the threshold into the hallway. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I realized I was standing in front of a staircase. It was made of concrete and was very damp. The air was thick with the smell of soil. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should go down it. I mean, where did it lead? What if it was some sort of emergency exit? But curiosity got the better of me, and I started to descend the stairs. It seemed to take a long time before I finally reached the bottom, though it probably only would have taken a minute or two to walk down it. I turned on the light at the bottom and stepped into what was basically a carbon copy of my apartment, except that this room was darker and colder and it smelled like dirt. The window was open and rainwater was dripping onto the floor from a crack in the ceiling, just like in my apartment. But that wasn't what caught my attention. In the bed, curled up under the blanket, was a person. I froze for a moment, staring at them, trying to figure out if they were real or if I was hallucinating. Because what I was seeing was a person who looked exactly like me, right down to the way my hair stuck out in every direction. Except, of course, that whoever this person was, they were asleep, and I was wide awake. I stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out what to do. Should I wake them up? Should I call the police? Was this person dangerous? A million questions were running through my head, and I couldn't figure out what to do. Then I heard a noise from behind me. Someone was slowly climbing the stairs. I spun around to look, but it was too dark to see anything. Then the footsteps stopped. Whoever was up there must have seen my light and decided to go away. I don't know. Well, obviously, I didn't end up getting any sleep after that. and I spent most of the night sitting in that room wondering what the hell was going on. Eventually, the sun came up, and I left to go find somewhere nicer to live. I never went back to that place, and I never found out what was going on. To this day, it's one of the biggest mysteries of my life. The wind howled like a banshee outside, and rain lashed against the windows of the old city library. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, seeking refuge from the storm inside. The power flickered and died, plunging the cavernous space into near darkness. Unable to see, I made my way to a nearby table and waited for the worst of the storm to pass. I could hear the rain intensifying, drumming a wild tattoo on the glass ceiling above me. It would be a long time before I could leave, so I got up and started to explore the shadowy aisles. That's when I first saw them. Tall, thin figures that seemed to be brushing the tops of their heads against the low ceiling. They appeared to be shuffling through the books, taking their sweet time about it. At first, I assumed they were just shadows cast by the flickering neon light from the emergency exit sign above, but then one of the figures reached out and pulled a book from the shelf. Cautiously, I stepped closer. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. The figure was definitely real, or as real as I was, if not more so. Its head was too tall for its body, impossibly thin, with sharp angles and disturbingly smooth contours. Its hands were long and spindly, its fingers tipped with what looked like talons. It turned to face me, and I gasped. Its face wasn't human. In fact, I can't even begin to describe what it looked like, not with any accuracy at least. I just know that it wasn't human. Its eyes, if that's what they were, burned with an otherworldly light. And when it opened its mouth, I saw rows and rows of sharp, uneven teeth. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my haste to put some distance between myself and the creature. But it didn't seem to notice me at all. Or perhaps it didn't care. It returned to the bookshelf, and with seeming effortlessness, pulled another book from the shelves. Curiosity, or perhaps morbid fascination, compelled me forward. What did this creature want with the books? Was it trying to read them? I stopped a few feet away and peered into the creature's face. Its head was tilted slightly, as if studying me. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, afraid to break the spell that had me transfixed. Then it did something that made me exhale involuntarily. It reached out and touched the cover of the book it was holding. The creature slid the book closed, and in that instant, I saw the title, Your Death. I couldn't believe my eyes. Could this be some kind of sick joke? Some macabre prank perpetrated by whoever was responsible for stocking the library? But there was no humor in the creature's posture, in the set of its shoulders, in the tilt of its unnerving head. Slowly, it raised the book, and I saw that the pages were filled with indecipherable symbols and diagrams. The creature opened the book wider, revealing a blank page. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It pointed a finger at me and began to write. At first, I couldn't make out what it was writing, but as it continued, the writing grew larger and clearer. By the time it finished, I could read what it had written. Tomorrow, it said. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the writing stopped. The creature closed the book, and I couldn't help myself. I blurted out, "What does it mean?" The creature looked up, and for a moment I thought it might answer my question. Then it did something even more terrifying. It smiled, or at least something that resembled a smile. Its lips curled, revealing more teeth, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to flee. I don't know why I did it, but I ran. I ran as fast as I could through the labyrinthine stacks, the creature's mocking laughter echoing in my ears. Finally, I burst through the front doors and stumbled out into the rain. Safe at last, I collapsed onto a nearby bench, my heart pounding in my chest. As I struggled to catch my breath, I looked back at the library, my mind racing. What had I really seen in there? Was I suffering from some kind of mental breakdown? Had I imagined the whole thing? The storm had passed, and a rainbow arced across the sky. The sight was beautiful, almost otherworldly, and I couldn't help but think of the creature in the library, its strange, unsettling beauty, its otherworldly air. I knew then that what I had seen was no illusion. I had glimpsed something that existed just beyond the veil of our everyday reality, something that brushed up against our world on rare occasions, something that was a part of neither the world of the living nor the world of the dead, but something in between, something that was forever beyond our understanding. Let's go back to the beginning of this terrifying tale. It was one of those hot summer days where even the trees are sweating and the air itself shimmers with heat. I was in my grandmother's attic, which hadn't been cleaned out in decades. It was filled with all sorts of strange and wonderful things, and as I sifted through these relics of the past, I came across an old leather-bound diary. It was beautiful, but I could tell just from its worn exterior that it was very important to whoever had owned it. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed that it was locked shut. Curiosity got the better of me, and I spent the next few minutes trying to find a keyhole. There wasn't one. It was then that I heard a voice, a whisper right in my ear that said, "Let me in." I nearly jumped out of my skin and whirled around to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Had I been sitting in the attic too long and finally lost my mind? I rubbed my ears and told myself that it was just the wind. Surely it was just the wind. But as I turned back to the diary, the voice whispered again, this time saying, "Please let me in before the storm comes." A shiver ran down my spine because although the day was hot, dark clouds were starting to gather overhead. A storm was indeed coming, and something about the urgency in the voice made me want to help. Somehow I managed to force the diary open and a musty smell wafted out. Inside the first page I saw a name written in elegant script. It was a woman's name, the same name as my grandmother. I looked up to see the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. The diary had started to rain. I flipped open the diary to a random page and began to read. "Today is my birthday. I am 18 years old. What will the future hold for me?" I read on. "I have met a handsome young man today and we walked in the rain. His name is Henry and he makes me laugh like no other." My grandmother did indeed have a great sense of humor, I thought, smiling as I read more about her meeting up with her friends or going to the market. It was a sweet diary and I felt honored to be reading these private thoughts and feelings. And then I noticed something strange. All of these entries were dated today, July 1944. But why? Why were all the entries dated the same day? And why did the last one say today? Had my grandmother written it right before she died? She had been born in 1926, so she would have been 18 in 1944. The war was raging and many young men were sent to the front lines to fight. Perhaps she wrote the diary entry right before her sweetheart went off to war and never returned. Maybe that's why the diary was locked. She wanted her memories of him to stay safe, hidden away in the attic. I continued reading and the words swam before my eyes. "I am getting married in 2 weeks. Oh, how I love Henry. I cannot wait to spend the rest of my life with him. We will be so happy together." I closed the diary with a sigh. How sad that she had lost him. But what happened after? Where did the diary end? I opened it once more and began to read the final entry. At 3:12 a.m., lightning strikes. He sees the face at the window. He doesn't survive. I laughed nervously. So that was the ending. The diary ended with the death of her husband. How dramatic. But it wasn't even midnight yet. I shrugged off my unease and closed the diary. Then I noticed that the clock on the wall read 3:11. My eyes widened in horror as the final sentence of the diary entry echoed in my head. He sees the face at the window. I whipped my head around to stare out into the darkness, but there was nothing out there but the raging storm. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. Of course it was just a coincidence. But as if to prove the diary's final entry correct, the window behind me suddenly lit up white as lightning cracked and thunder roared. If you enjoyed this scary story, stay tuned for more. And as always, thanks for watching. From my bedroom window, I can see the old funeral home. It's been closed for years. The paint is peeling off its gables and the lawn is overgrown with weeds and the trees. But every so often, during a really bad storm, I'll see the lights flicker on inside. And last night was one of those nights. It was raining really hard when I went to bed. And when I woke up, I had this overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something in the air, some premonition that something terrible had happened or was about to happen. I got up, walked over to my window, and looked out into the driving rain. And that's when I saw them. 3 men in black suits were standing on the steps of my porch. They were drenched in the rain. Their faces were pale and drawn, their shoulders slumped. And in their midst was a coffin. It wasn't wrapped in any kind of protective covering. It was just out in the rain. And as I watched, one of the men lifted the corner of the lid ever so slightly, just enough to peer out into the yard. Then he turned his head and looked up at my window. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. All I know is that at some point I started screaming, and the 3 men jumped, startled. They ran inside and slammed the door. When I went to my front door and looked out, the yard was wet and muddy. There were tire tracks leading up to my driveway, but the men and the coffin were gone. This isn't the first time this has happened. In the 3 years I've lived here, the funeral home has only been used twice. Once for an actual funeral, and once for a viewing. That was 2 years ago. I never saw the people inside, but I heard them talking. They were trying to resuscitate someone. I don't want to be too dramatic, but it felt like they were trying to raise the dead. Well, last night was the 3rd time. And just like before, I didn't see the face of the deceased. But I did notice the ring on the finger of one of the men who carried the coffin. It was a simple silver band with a stone in the center, and as he walked up my driveway, I could have sworn it flashed in the darkness. Today I got up early and went out into the yard. The grass was wet and the tire tracks from last night were still visible, leading up to my door. I noticed something else, something shaped like a coffin lying on its side in the grass. I walked over and sure enough, it was a coffin. Or at least it was a mold of a coffin, as if someone had taken the shape of the coffin and pressed it into the grass. There was no mistaking what it was. It was the exact size and shape of the coffin from last night, and it wasn't there yesterday. So who were those men? Who was in the coffin? And why did they leave the impression of the coffin in my yard? I called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do. Apparently the funeral home was abandoned 10 years ago, and the building's owner doesn't even live in the state. I asked the neighbors if they knew anything, but all they said was that the funeral home had a pretty shady reputation, even back when it was open. Apparently, a lot of the town's business was conducted within those 4 walls, business that had nothing to do with death. So now I'm stuck with a creepy abandoned funeral home across the street from my house, and whatever it is those men were doing in the middle of the night, they're not from around here. And to prove it, none of them had local license plates. One had a California plate, one had a New York plate, and one had a Michigan plate. So now I'm stuck with a creepy abandoned funeral home across the street from my house, and whatever it is those men were doing in the middle of the night. Yeah. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the whole thing just feels wrong. I feel like something terrible is about to happen. Last night, the men looked up at my window as if waiting for me to move. And this morning, they left the impression of the coffin in my yard. It's almost like they were trying to send me a message. But what does it mean? And what's in that coffin? As I sat down to write this, the power went out. My phone is almost dead. And when I tried to call my wife, all I got was voicemail. I don't know if she's at work or if it's another one of those weird coincidences, but it's starting to feel like this story is somehow connected to me. Like whatever is in that coffin is reaching out from beyond the grave to try and pull me back in. Like subscribe and comment for more creepy stories.